There is an old tradition of leave-taking in the west of Ireland. Before departing home and Clachan, emigrants brought their fire to the fire of a neighbour, in the hope that one day they would come home to reclaim it, and with it, their place in the old world. For hundreds of thousands who fled Ireland during the Great Famine in the 1840s, that homecoming would never take place. Patrick Kaveney, a Gaelic-speaking emigrant from Cross in South Sligo, was one such Gearóid, or man of tears, as emigrants were called in the ancient language of Ireland. He left his home in Sligo in early 1847. He would never return.
Kom aan, niet heel goed te worden.
Daar is gewoon voor de fetch.
Thomas Reid en vocher in isje worden. Ik spoil me shocker zeggen de hinne.
How is it, Leonard?
This famine story is different from the other well-known stories of remembrance.
Can I live in Canada, fetch?
There are no national monuments or parades, no fanfares or political eulogies in this story.
𝐿𝐄𝐒𝐄𝐓𝐈𝐂𝐑𝐿.
Just a quiet epic of survival kept alive by a francophone family on Quebec's Gaspé peninsula. A family whose Gaelic-speaking ancestors left the west of Ireland in 1847. It's a story of remembrance that took 5 generations to create and 168 years to bring home to a fire that waited for its makers in the old world. As tragic in its global consequences as the Jewish Holocaust and the Armenian genocide, the Great Irish Famine was the worst humanitarian disaster to occur in Western Europe in the 19th century, leaving 1 million dead and another million exiled. This tragedy occurred next door to the leading industrial power of the day, Great Britain, whose policies of unregulated free trade helped seal the destiny of its island neighbours. The gravitational pull of this famine continues to impact the Republic of Ireland today. Its population declined from 6.5 million in 1841 to 3.2 million in 1911 and 2.8 million in 1961. With a population of 4.7 million today, Ireland is the only nation-state in the Western world with fewer people than it had in the mid-19th century. The most devastating in a series of famines that plagued Ireland in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Great Famine began when a fungus-like pathogen named Phytophthora infestans appeared in Ireland in the summer of 1845. Previously unknown in Europe, this microorganism began its global journey in South America. Carried north over the equator in guana shipments bound for the US, it spread inland to the Midwestern states before crossing the Atlantic on ships carrying timber between Canada and Europe. Reaching the south of England, it crossed the Channel to Belgium and Holland and rotted potatoes in Flanders before moving down the Rhine. It also destroyed potato harvests in the Highlands of Scotland. but it found its principal victims in Ireland, where massive population growth had swelled the ranks of the poor and the landless since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Although wheat was grown in Ireland as a cash crop to pay rent and to export to British markets, the potato was the main staple of the poor, who consumed 10 pounds of potatoes a day before the famine. When this generous crop failed, starvation set in, and with it disease and destitution. Men and women without the means to pay their rent were now turned out of their cabins to live in dugout scalps or seek refuge in the workhouse, a bastille for the destitute in Victorian times. For the lucky, exile offered some hope of a better life in the new world. For the less fortunate, escape from famine ended on coffin ships that failed to brave the Atlantic or cut through the icy squalls in the St. Lawrence. Physical scars of this famine are everywhere to behold in Ireland, in its dark, spectral effigies, empty valleys, lazy bed gardens, and mass graves filled with the remains of the anonymous dead. Cultural and linguistic scars lie deeper still within the depths of the Irish psyche. The Irish language and its custodians never fully recovered from the devastation of the famine. Irish was spoken with a classless self-confidence by 90% of the population in the west of Ireland in the 1840s. One of the oldest and literate languages in Oceanic Europe, it housed centuries of history and folklore, music and mythology, much of it ravaged by the cultural cleansing of the famine on 𝐷𝐴𝐻𝐿
Pobl mascathe a bhí in éireann ó hebh teangada an nuascaidí aimsir a gorta mhór. Is féidir go raibh leath de ghaonn na tíre, gur gaelgóirí iad I lár na nachadaí. Agus in íorthar na tíre bhíonn codán níos air de fós. Agus an nuas sin is féidir go bhfuil beidir leath den méid sin I ríist, 2 mhilliún nó os a chiún, gur gaelgóirí a bháiniad, monoglat, sé sin ar a béirlear bitheacha. Nis, caig go raibh cuid den bobal sin, go háirithe in éon chuid díothar na tíre má thugamid ó 𝐿𝐿 abramis go híothar chorcaí, taobh hir den lína sang. Na himmercaig a dul amachas éireann trasna an Atlantic, a nuas go dtí an gorta mór, bheadh scíor láidir díobh ina ngailgóirí, le gaelge bháin dan béirle, nó beagán béirle agus gaelge go príomhacha mar hanga acu.
Ringed by lakes and drumlins, the village of Keash sits on the edge of an ancient territory ruled by the O'Connor Sligo, whose ancestors were High Kings of Ireland. The Curlew Mountains guard this region to the south. Leitrim is further east, and beyond it the Black Pig's Dyke and the lowlands of Ulster. On the eve of the famine, Keash was home to 300 Irish-speaking families. Among them Patrick Kaveney, his wife Sarah MacDonald and their 6 children. Their home in the townland of Cross faced an old stone church that sheltered Catholics in penal times. 𝐶𝐴𝐿 Mountain, with its labyrinth of caves, towers above this verdant place. Shrouded in Ice Age mystery, 𝐶𝐴𝐿 was a portal to the other world, ruled by the Tuatha Dé Danann and their fairy hordes. Cormac MacArt was born here in 226 AD, and like Rome's Romulus and Remus, he was said to have been raised by a she-wolf before leaving for Tara to become High King of Ireland. The last Gaelic lords of this region were the O'Garas and the MacDermots, remembered for their patronage and hospitality and their kindness during hard times. Ancient Gaelic patronage was a distant memory in South Sligo by 1840. By 1841, the population had swelled like never before its land and resources stretched to capacity. The constant subdivision of farms meant that more and more people were now living on smaller plots of ground than their predecessors. In Keash, catastrophe was never more than a failed harvest away. That catastrophe came with the potato blight in August 1845. 3 months later, the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, purchased £100,000 worth of Indian corn from America to offset the loss of the potato in Ireland. Relief committees were set up and food depots established across the country. As the crisis deepened, food riots broke out and the police were called to protect supplies. Despite the hunger that now ravaged Ireland, moral Brahmins in Britain believed that the Irish famine was an act of divine providence. Unlike other European countries who responded to crop failure by closing their ports to exports, Britain clung fervently to laissez-faire economics. Throughout the famine, Irish landlords, strong farmers and merchants continued to export grain and live cattle to Britain. God and free trade, it seemed, were on the same side. The face of British intransigence in Ireland was Charles Trevelyan, head of the Irish Treasury, who was of the opinion that the Irish were lazy and feckless and did not deserve direct government help. They would have to work for it. New public works laws were passed in March 1846, and within a year 750,000 malnourished paupers, men, women and children, were working long days breaking stones, raising walls around landed estates and building roads to nowhere in the west of Ireland. By now, Peel's Tory government had ceded power to the Whigs under Lord John Russell, who was less disposed towards Irish charity. In July, the Treasury announced that all public works would stop, believing that the new harvest would bring the famine to an end. Russell's assumption proved fatal. The potato harvest of 1846 was even more disastrous than that of the previous year. Food prices increased in towns and cities across the country, among them Sligo, where profit-hungry merchants took advantage of the hungry, who earned less than 8 pence a day. Cries for help rang out across the nation. In August 1846, Patrick Kaveney put his name to a petition signed by his parish priest James O'Hara and 380 of his neighbours, which they sent to the Lord Lieutenant begging for public works in Keash. Their appeal fell on deaf ears. As autumn gave way to winter, severe weather prolonged their suffering. The winter of 1846-47 was one of the coldest on record, with snow falling as late as April 47. Families living at the foot of 𝐾𝐿 mountain were bitterly cold and starving. By now, landlords with too many tenants were desperate to avoid bankruptcy. Some were torn between benevolence and their own economic survival. Others gave little thought to charity, as they began mass evictions to clear the Rundale clutter from their estates and square their land.
The landscape was all open. Farms were divided up into little strips with ditches and little mearings and banks and so on, dividing them up. All the tenants lived in clusters, farm clusters. Essentially, the landscape was in a kind of chaotic condition. Squaring the land was the approach to tidy up the landscape, to actually break up all these village clusters, take the farms of 5 or 6 acres, possibly increase them to 15 or 20 acres, divide them up into big rectangular or parallelogram kind of shapes along roads, build a house on the farm, persuade the farmer to live on his farm, and so on and so forth. The only way that that could be operationalized on the ground was to persuade some of the tenants to give up their farms and to emigrate.
The human cost of this policy was of little consequence to men of profit and progress, especially absentee landlords who lived in England. Sligo's most prominent absentee landlord was Henry John Temple, 3rd Viscount Palmerston. A wealthy aristocrat with estates in Hampshire and Yorkshire and houses in Dublin and London, Palmerston owned a vast estate in Sligo that his predecessors seized after the Cromwellian conquest. In the 1820s, he hired a marine engineer, Alexander Nimmo, to build a stone harbour in Mullaghmore. On a peninsula beyond the village, Palmerston built a baronial summer house, 𝐶𝐸 Castle, for which the hamlet of Mullaghmore was raised, so that his lordship would have a clear view of his land. As the famine spiralled out of control, Palmerston's estate became chronically overpopulated. His land in a hamlet in North Sligo housed 5,800 tenants and 4,000 paupers. The rest of his tenants were 30 miles away near Ballymote in South Sligo. In the spring of 1847, his lawyers, J.R. Stewart and Joseph Kincaid in Dublin, and their agents in Sligo, began clearing excess tenants from his estate and squaring his land. They also selected tenants for assisted emigration, a draconian clearing plan that was used on the estate for the next 20 years. A lawyer with a shrewd eye on his lordship's profit, Kincaid advocated assisted emigration purely for economic reasons.
I actually take issue with that term, assisted immigration. That's a very lovely euphemism for what actually was, in every sense of the word, eviction. So you get a landlord or a landlord's agent, and they were feared and dreaded around the countryside, coming to your house and telling you that you're behind on the rent and intimidating and threatening and so on. The landlords held sway at that time, and people had no recourse to courts or law or justice or anything. So they were forced to give up their land. I have something in my hand here that's a very rare thing to have actually. Not many of them have survived, but it's a copy of an eviction notice. And when we talk, it was no assisted immigration, I'll tell you that. And it's dated on the 24th day of February, 1847. Well, how cruel was that in the middle of a famine in 1847 to come to somebody's door and hand them that and say, well, you'll get £2 to £5 if you go now. Assisted immigration? I don't think so.
Patrick Kaveney and his family were selected for assisted emigration by Kincaid and Smith. They were told that they were going to Canada, where they would get new land. Kaveney, his wife Sarah, their teenage son Martin, and 5 daughters under the age of 10 were given 2 weeks to prepare for the journey. They left their home in Cross on April the 3rd, 1847, with 117 of their neighbours to walk the 20 miles to the port of Sligo. They would never return. In the century between the Battle of Waterloo and the start of World War I, 8 million people left Ireland, among them 300,000 assisted emigrants whose fares were paid by landlords, churches and poor law unions. Most sailed the seaways between Europe and North America. Others crossed the equator to Argentina, or rounded the tip of Africa into the Indian Ocean to reach Australia and New Zealand. Leaving before the age of detailed logs and manifests, few left personal traces of their exodus. Their anonymous voices live on in the music and songs of emigration, and in random reminders in the landscape they fled. Canada Cross, in Milltown Malbay, County Clare, where they gathered before setting off for distant ports. The Bridge of Tears near Falcarra in West Donegal, where families keened their final farewell. And America, a crossroads in a lonesome Connemara valley, where emigrants were waked before leaving home.
Well, sin fá doctor an táime an náise Montréal an 𝐒𝐄 𝐂𝐡𝐢𝐥 fado, agus doctor party bega chun seo a grúspáir san an imodís, agus sin go leor chu a dimi ní réad sí riamh, mar amsin an gorta ná rivan gorta ná taréis an gorta, bhí rudí an dana hata seo, bhí ochchas arthú agus níor hata bh bhím i teachta leis.
The port of Sligo on the 𝐅𝐅𝐈𝐂𝐷𝐿 River was one of the busiest in the west of Ireland during the famine years. Between April and October 1847, 65 ships carrying 13,000 famine emigrants sailed out of Sligo. Among them, 9 ships hired by Palmerston to transport 2,000 of his surplus tenants to North America. His lordship would sponsor 10% of all assisted passages from Ireland during the famine years. The vessel Palmerston hired to transport the Kaveneys and their neighbours was the Carricks of Whitehaven, a 240-ton brig built in Cumbria in the north of England in 1812. Fitted with a copper-sheathed hull, the Carricks was a seasoned workhorse that had a history of transporting lumber from Canada and human cargo from Britain and Ireland. Its reputation, however, was already well tarnished in Quebec before it set sail from Sligo. In 1832, it was the first ship to arrive in Quebec from Europe with cholera on board. On board the Carricks, the Kaveneys met tenants from Palmerston's large estate in North Sligo, families from Mullaghmore, Creevy Keel and the monastic island of Inishmurray, 4 miles off the Sligo coast. The master of the Carricks was Captain Robert Thompson from Sunderland, who was responsible for a crew of 10 as well as 173 passengers. A 2-mast brig weighted down by heavy sail, the Carricks was smaller than other ships of the period. Despite the miserable conditions on board, the Carricks made good time crossing the Atlantic. It left Sligo on April the 5th and reached the mouth of the St. Lawrence on the night of May the 18th, 1847. The story of the Carricks has been preserved for 5 generations by the Kavanagh family in the outer Gaspé. A great-great-grandson of Patrick Kaveney, Georges Kavanagh is a French-speaking Quebecois historian who is deeply proud of his Irish heritage. He first heard about the tragedy of his Irish ancestors from his grandfather when he was a child. For the past 70 years, Georges has followed every lead and plotted every detail of the Carricks tragedy along the Gaspé coast.
Le 4 avril 1847, Patrick Kaveney, Sarah McDonnell et 6 enfants, donc un garçon, 5 filles, prennent place à bord de ce bateau. On est sur ce navire 173 passagers, des immigrants qui cherchent à fuir un pays où il n'y a plus d'espoir. Et on est logé dans les cales sous les ponts. Il n'y a aucune installation d'hygiène, il n'y a aucun lieu d'intimité. On couche sur des supports accrochés au flanc du bateau et en faisant la tête à pied pour sauver des espaces. On se nourrit avec probablement du poisson frais quand on est près des côtes et qu'on peut le pêcher. Et on est là avec, entassé dans l'humidité avec des odeurs qui sont insupportables. On peut penser à tous ceux qui sont atteints du choléra, de la dystérie, même le mal de mer, les vomissements que ça entraîne. Des gens meurent et sont là souvent à attendre des quelques heures et peut-être des journées avant qu'on puisse les sortir et les rejeter à la mer.
4 miles off Cap de Rosier on the Gaspé Peninsula, where the Appalachians plummet into the Gulf, disaster struck. The ship was caught in a nor'easter, a fast-moving storm caused by cold winds from Labrador clashing with warm currents from the south. The biting wind and ice froze the sails and rigging in the darkness, and for hours the ship tossed and turned in the channel between 𝐈𝐑𝐈𝐒𝐇 Island and the Gaspé. As the storm thundered on, the exhausted crew tried in vain to furl the ice-covered sails. Eventually, the top-heavy ship tilted and rolled over. Shortly after, the Carricks was torn asunder and sunk beneath the gulf, bringing most of Palmerston's tenants with it to a watery grave. The crew clung to spars and boats and managed to avoid the sinking wreck.
A crew of 9 who've just done a rough transatlantic crossing in bad weather, who probably had all their watches doubled up, I'd imagine, because they're trying to deal with all this ice that's building up in the deck of the ship. They're exhausted. Yeah, I would have thought that the icing was the major issue there. Even if you did furl up the sails, the ice is still going to build up on your sails, your masts, your yards, your rigs, the shrouds, everything, which makes the ship heavy. And this is still a problem for modern day ships.
As dawn broke on Cap de Rosier, Mother Nature's carnage was ubiquitous. 48 survivors managed to straggle onto dry land. One woman with a child in her arms floated ashore when a wave lifted her skirts and pushed her forward. Some huddled together amid the timbers and flotsam. Others combed the shore in search of loved ones. Patrick Kaveney found his wife Sarah and teenage son Martin, shaken but alive. Their 5 daughters were nowhere to be found. Throughout the morning of May the 19th, 87 corpses were washed ashore. The fast-moving current in the Gulf of St. Lawrence swept the others away. One of the first responders to reach the scene was Michael Dowling, a young priest from County Westmeath who had a mission in the outer Gaspé. He found bodies and wreckage strewn along the shore for 1.5 miles. After ministering to the sick and dying, he gave his shoes to a survivor and walked away, a broken man. As the day wore on, locals arrived and began to bury the dead in a mass grave near the shore. A monument was built there by the parishioners of St. Patrick's Parish in Montreal in 1900, only to be shattered by the tide in more recent times. The ship's bell was washed ashore on the Straits of Belle-Île, 300 kilometres away on the north shore of the Gulf in 1966. The bell is all that survives of the Carricks, a sonic reminder of flight that ended within sight of the new world.
Le lendemain de cette catastrophe, Patrick se retrouve sur la grève avec Sarah, son épouse, et son fils Martin. Les 5 filles qui ont entre 2 et 10 ans n'y sont plus. On sort d'une aventure où on a perdu 5 enfants.
The day after the disaster, the captain of the Carricks, Robert Thompson, penned a report in Cap de Rosier that eventually made its way back to newspapers in Britain and Ireland. In it, he said,
"I'm sorry to inform you that the brig Carricks was wrecked about 4 miles to the eastward of this place, and shocking to relate, out of 173 passengers, only 48 reached the shore. The crew, except one boy, were all saved."
Had the Carricks continued upriver towards Quebec City, less than a week's sail away, it would have docked at the quarantine station in Grosse-Île before proceeding into the Canadian interior. By then, a flotilla of 40 ships carrying 12,500 passengers stretched several kilometres down the river from the island, all waiting to clear quarantine. 𝐿 was the final resting place of 5,500 victims of Ireland's Great Famine. One observer said that the Irish dead were stacked like cordwood in common graves as the ships emptied their cargoes of hunger and disease. Between 1846 and 1850, Canada received 200,000 Irish famine refugees. 20,000 died in the summer of 1847, mainly at sea. Others in quarantine stations, fever sheds, orphanages and shanty towns in New Brunswick, Quebec and Ontario. In July 1847, the Canadian authorities sent 2 ships, the Maria Julia and the Emerald, to the Gaspé to pick up the survivors of the Carricks and bring them to 𝐿 for quarantine. Still in a state of shock, Patrick Kaveney adamantly refused to board another ship.
Les quelques survivants, il restait quelques 48 qui avaient été transférés à 𝐿. Patrick, lui, pour sa part, avait refusé ce transfert à 𝐿. Patrick doit reprendre vie un peu, donc il a pu bénéficier de cette occasion pour s'installer à Cap-des-Rosiers.
In November 1847, the last of Palmerston's 9 ships, the Aeolus, arrived in Partridge Island, New Brunswick. Port officials who inspected the vessel were appalled by the emaciated condition of the 428 passengers on board. They disembarked half naked and barefoot, just as the Canadian winter closed in around them. Unable to progress up the St. Lawrence because of ice, they spent the winter in the almshouse in St. John. Bad press and public outcry on both sides of the Atlantic forced Palmerston and his agents to explain the state of his tenants to authorities in Canada and Britain. If assisted emigration to British North America was successful before the famine, Palmerston's quick fix solution in 1847 began and ended with human tragedy. The appalling loss of life on the Carricks and the appalling spectre of starving men, women and children emerging from the dark belly of the Aeolus on the frozen waters of the St. Lawrence. By the time the Kaveneys began their new life in the Gaspé in 1847, the Irish had been coming and going from Quebec for over a century. The majority of Irish immigrants who settled in Canada in the early 19th century were Protestant farmers and artisans. These were followed by Catholic labourers and tradesmen. Most put down roots in an arc of rural settlements north and south of Quebec City, in the eastern townships, the Laurentians, and eventually in Pontiac in western Quebec. Their new farms lay outside the line of the feudal French seigneuries that dominated the banks of the St. Lawrence. Other Irish followed the industrial frontier as it moved down the river from Quebec City to Montreal. They found work in dockyards and canals, mills and foundries, city councils and services. By the 1840s, the Irish occupied all classes of society and all parts of the city of Montreal. By 1845, the Irish were so numerous in Quebec City that the city council banned the playing of hurling on the streets of the city. The new life the Kaveneys built in the Gaspé was far removed from the political fathers and merchant princes of urban Quebec. They had left a small inland farm in Sligo and now found themselves on the edge of a great inland sea, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, a fishing ground for the Mi'kmaq First Nation as well as Basques and Acadians for centuries. The Kaveneys, however, knew nothing about industrial fishing. They knew less about the climate that awaited them. The mild winters and soft springs they were familiar with in Ireland now gave way to the intense cold of the Canadian winter and long hot summers. On the barren Gaspé coast, farming was subsistence farming and was a poor substitute for the wealth offered by the river. When the river froze in winter, men worked in lumber camps in the Appalachians to earn extra income until the cod season started again in spring. Like most famine emigrants from the west of Ireland, Pat Kaveney and his wife Sarah also had linguistic challenges to cope with in the new world. They had left an Irish-speaking community in Sligo where education was offered through Irish in traditional hedge schools, long before one of Lord Stanley's English national schools was built in Keash. Now they found themselves in a world where French was the dominant vernacular.
Immigrants from South Sligo, or from any of the parts where Irish was the main language, finding French as the language of the new society in which they were to settle, would have had no reason whatever to be Anglophones. Their process of assimilation and integration would have been eased by moving from their own intimate language of Irish to the new dominant language of the new settlement, which would have been French. The matter of English would not have intruded at all until much later.
The ancient language that the Kaveneys and others brought with them to Canada survived long after them. One of the last native speakers of Irish in the province was Jack Scallon from 𝐷 A travelling fiddler by profession, Scallon was 84 years old when he died in 1953. He never set foot in Ireland, yet he and his neighbours spoke Irish for 3 generations after it was presumed dead in Canada. As the Kaveneys settled down to raise a new family in exile, tragedy continued to stalk them. On the 16th of March 1855, 7 years after he left Sligo, Patrick set off from his home in Jersey Cove and trekked through the snow over the northern tip of the Appalachians. Every year since arriving in Canada, he had celebrated St. Patrick's Day with Irish friends in Douglastown. The last leg of the day-long journey to Douglastown required choosing a 20-mile walk along the shore or a 5-mile shortcut across the frozen bay of Gaspé. Patrick had opted for the shortcut on previous occasions. This time, tragically, fortune would not favour the brave.
Il est confirmé qu'il est venu ici au magasin Hyman pour d'abord se réchauffer parce qu'on est quand même à la mi-mars et il est à pied. Donc il rentre ici pour se réchauffer, fumer une pipette de tabac et possiblement, oui, un petit remontant avant de s'enligner, de prendre la glace pour Douglastown. Mais on connaît la fin de l'histoire. Malheureusement, il ne s'est jamais rendu. Une fois parti, le vent se lève, il y a une petite pourderie, il perd les traces que laissaient les chevaux et avec le temps, il perd probablement tout contact avec son environnement. Il n'y a plus de point de repère et il dérive de sa route, qui fait qu'il ne s'est jamais rendu l'autre bord. Et 3 jours après, les gens s'inquiètent. On ne l'a pas vu à la fête de la Saint-Patrick et personne ne sait où il est rendu. Sarah s'inquiète du côté de Cap-des-Rosiers. Et finalement, un type de capozo remarque qu'en face de sa fenêtre de cuisine, il remarque que les corneilles et goélands ont une attitude un peu bizarre au-dessus de la glace. Donc, décide d'aller, met ses raquettes, décide d'aller voir qu'est-ce qui se passe et trouve Patrick mort gelé sur la glace. C'était pour Sarah un coup difficile parce qu'elle était enceinte et en attente d'un 4e enfant né au Québec qui va arriver 3 mois après le décès de Patrick.
Patrick's tragic death would change Sarah's life forever. 3 months after he died, she gave birth to their 10th child. She now had to adjust to life as a widow and a single mother of 4 small children. She raised her family while her new homeland argued its way towards confederation, and she continues to inspire her descendants 5 generations later.
J'ai énormément d'admiration et de respect pour cette femme que j'aurais aimé vraiment connaître. Lors de la mort de Patrick en 1855, Sarah attend un 4e enfant. Elle n'a pas, comme on pourrait espérer aujourd'hui, l'aide sociale ou la pension de veuve ou l'aide aux enfants orphelins. Elle doit se débrouiller seule. Bien sûr, Martin, qui est le plus vieux, autour d'une vingtaine d'années, peut donner un coup de main, mais ça a dû demander un terrible effort, un terrible travail, et tout ça sans dépression nerveuse, et à tel point qu'elle a vécu jusqu'au 13 octobre 1889, alors qu'elle est décédée, et elle avait 85 ans.
Sarah MacDonald was laid to rest beside her husband in a grave overlooking the sea that took their 5 girls in May 1847. In the century and a half since then, their children and their children's children have created new lives and explored new frontiers across the North American continent. Educated in small rural schools in the Gaspé and colleges in Quebec City, the Kaveney children and their descendants became Kavanaghs as they grew away from their Irish roots. As time passed, the communal world they created would resemble an Irish rural clachan, where people worked together and lived 𝐅𝐄𝐒𝐄 in the shadow of each other. In 2015, 168 years after they left, Gearóid Kaveney made his own pilgrimage to his ancestors' village in South Sligo.
Je me souviens, à l'école primaire, autour de 10 ans peut-être, on avait chacun, en entrant, à remplir un petit questionnaire sur notre nom, le nom de notre père, le nom de notre mère, puis notre nationalité. Et moi, je me souviens d'avoir inscrit irlandais. Souvent, lorsqu'on avait des questionnaires comme ça, j'étais porté à dire qu'il fallait que je dise que j'étais de descendance irlandaise. En contrepartie, je me sens très québécois. Donc, c'est un mélange un peu de... Je suis un Québécois, Canadien, Irlandais. Je trouvais chanceux d'aller voir la terre, d'aller voir le pays où nos ancêtres sont nés, où ils avaient vécu. Et dans ma tête, depuis 7 ans, j'avais 18, 19 ou 20 ans, j'ai tout le temps gardé cette ambition de revoir cette Irlande, de voir moi-même cette Irlande.
On Dublin's Custom House Quay, where the Jeannie Johnson famine ship is moored, George and his family found reminders of their history in the bronze statues created by Irish artist Rowan Gillespie, an installation that has a companion memorial in Toronto's Ireland Park. After crossing the island to the Atlantic coast, the Kavanaghs were given a warm welcome. Local insight now shone further light on the final journey of Patrick and Sarah and the false promises they were given about the land that awaited them in Canada.
Sligo. Good. That is the view of Sligo that they would have got coming in the old stagecoach road, which is this road here, as they came into Sligo town. Your relatives would have walked down this street to Sligo. Do you understand me? Yes. And this is the entrance into Sligo. They would have come down this roadway here into Sligo town.
Ça, les terres de culture, et les aidera dans leur intégration, mais ce qui n'était pas le cas.
In Sligo's old port, now emptied of its ships and trade, the Kavanaughs tried to imagine the final moments of Patrick and Sarah before they boarded the Carricks, and the voices and commands of captain and sailors as they waited for the parting tide. The afterlife of the Great Famine came into focus on the drive through North Sligo, in the square fields spread out across the countryside and the locked gates that still guard Sligo's landed estates. In Mullaghmore, where Palmerston planned to spend his summers, Nimmo's pier still defies the Atlantic, and the icy turrets of 𝐋𝐨𝐬𝐭 Castle still pierce the sky at the foot of Ben Bulben. In Keash, in South Sligo, George Kavanagh's long quest for his people finally came to an end. Here in the heartland of the ordinary, far from the imperial past, he crossed the threshold of the home left behind by Patrick and Sarah in the shadow of 𝐾𝐿 mountain. All that remains now is a small fragment of their stone cottage, but enough to relight the fire that Patrick took to his neighbour's house the morning he left Cross. The hope that someone would eventually come home to rekindle it had finally come to pass.
Et voilà, il ne faut jamais perdre espoir. La flamme gardera maintenant la mémoire de Patrick et Sarah.
Seigneur, tu me donnes aujourd'hui, à ma famille et moi, l'occasion de rêver, de toucher à cette terre qui appartenait à Patrick, Sarah. Je t'en remercie et garde-nous dans cet esprit familial pour les jours qui nous restent.
In the Fox's Den pub in Keash, the music started early, as did the storytelling and the tracing. The missing links in the family tree could now be filled in with certainty.
Me and you, 5.
5.
Yeah. Patrick and him is 6.
Oh, yeah, that's right, that's right.
Your name is here.
Lui, ça sait plus que moi.
Your name?
Il se lance plus.
Kathleen, for the tree. For the... Ouais, pour faire l'arbre généalogique. Is yours?
Yeah.
Kathleen, is yours?
Yeah.
This is your father?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is grandfather?
Yeah.
Okay, grandfather, Patrick, 2 is here.
Yeah.
And Mary R?
Ouais.
Mary R?
Ouais, c'est ça. C'est ça. It's one drawing the
As night fell on the soiree, the Wards and the Kavanaghs drew closer to the lost world of their ancestors. old tunes and old songs bridging the seas between Sligo and the Gaspé. Unlike yesterday, tomorrow would now have a more familiar historical face. The lost children of the Carricks had finally found their bearings.
Il faut qu'avant l'aurore, nous soyons de retour pour sommeiller encore avant qu'il soit grand jour. Partons, la mer est belle, embarquons-nous pêcheurs, guidons notre nacelle, ramons avec ardeur, au maïssons les voiles, le ciel est pur et beau, je vois briller l'étoile qui guide les matelots.